My name is Julian Vega. I'm 42 years old. For most of my adult life, I played the role of the underachiever in a family addicted to titles and trophies. While they climbed corporate ladders, launched flashy startups, and married into country club dynasties, I stayed behind the scenes, consulting, building, refining, staying quiet. I was the oldest son of the second-born Vega brother, which in our family tree meant very little. Respect came from headlines, not heart. And I stopped trying to earn their applause a long time ago. The Vega family reunion was already buzzing when I pulled into the gates of the oceanfront estate in Laguna Beach, 38 minutes late on purpose. I learned years ago that showing up early only gives them more time to compare resumes and pretend you don't exist. I stepped out of my matte black rental in a pressed shirt, no tie, tailored slacks and loafers. No logo, no flash, just clean and intentional like everything I do. As I crossed the stone driveway, the first to greet me was Uncle Leon, his Rolex catching the light as he glanced at my wrist. "Julian," he said, offering a stiff handshake. "We were starting to think you forgot the address." I smiled thinly. Hard to forget a place that's burned into your memory. The main patio was packed. Cousins, partners, old family friends, laughter, glasses clinking, and stories that always seemed to get more exaggerated with each passing year. I spotted my younger cousin Adrian near the grill, surrounded by a crowd. Just last week, Forbes had listed his fintech app as one of the top 30 to watch. Never mind that I knew firsthand his user data was inflated and his Series B was being propped up by family trust money. But at Vega gatherings, image was truth, and I wasn't wearing mine on my sleeve. I poured myself a drink and tried to find a quiet spot near the edge of the deck. But of course I didn't get far. My Aunt Marisol, silver hair perfect, pearls tight around her neck, intercepted me with a polite smile. "Still between jobs, Julian?" she asked sweetly. "We heard you were consulting again." I nodded calmly. "That's right." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "maybe you should talk to Diego. He's hiring junior analysts for the expansion firm. Might be good for someone trying to find their footing." I didn't flinch. I've trained CEOs worth 10 times Diego's portfolio, but I kept my tone even. "Appreciate that. I'll think about it." The deeper sting came later, over dinner. As champagne was poured and speeches began, my younger brother Luca stood and toasted the family's new generation of leaders. He mentioned everyone. Cousins who'd joined hedge funds, one who'd married a senator's daughter, even his 19-year-old son who just interned at Morgan Stanley. But not me, not once. I raised my glass anyway. Sometimes silence is sharper than any insult. And then, as I sat there beneath the string lights and family mythology, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a single message from my lead counsel. 3 words: acquisition finalized. "Congratulations." I stared at the screen a moment longer, letting it all settle. In less than 12 hours, the press would break the story. The Vega family's prized private equity firm, Luca Vega Capital, had just been acquired by a quiet, anonymous entity, mine. Let the reunion begin. Growing up in the Vega family taught me 2 things early. Brilliance is nothing without spectacle, and silence is often mistaken for failure. I learned to keep my head down and study the dynamics, how respect in our circles came not from integrity, but from applause. Loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was measured by usefulness. And once you were no longer useful, you were dismissed. I saw it happen to my father, a brilliant engineer who was squeezed out of the family trust after he refused to back a reckless investment that later tanked. They called him bitter, said he lacked vision. He died before they ever admitted he was right. I was 16 when I realized I'd inherited more of his backbone than his bitterness. But I played the game better. I smiled through slights, laughed at jokes made at my expense, and listened. I remembered who said what, who controlled what, and more importantly, who depended on whom. They thought I was drifting because I didn't show off. They mistook strategy for uncertainty, and the more they dismissed me, the deeper I dug into my own lane. Still, I won't lie, words from family cut deeper than most, especially when they come disguised as concern. When I left Morgan Chase to start my own firm, they said I was impulsive. When I pivoted from tech to private acquisitions, they called it scatterbrained, and when I moved overseas to operate out of Lisbon for 2 years, I became the whispered disappointment. Julian's still trying to find himself, they'd say, as if clarity didn't come in silence, away from all their noise. I remember one Christmas, not long after I secured my first 8-figure acquisition, I flew in, brought gifts, tried to share the moment, but all they asked about was whether I was still freelancing. That word, it stuck like tar. Not investor, not founder, freelancer. To them, if your success didn't show up on a magazine cover or a panel, it didn't count. So, I stopped explaining. I stopped offering clarity to people who only valued chaos in shiny packaging. There's something strange about becoming the ghost in your own family. Present, polite, but entirely unseen. They'd ask about Luca's next real estate deal with wide eyes, yet barely register when I mentioned I was closing another European buyout. I never needed validation, but the repeated invisibility built something deeper than resentment. It built resolve, a slow, steady flame that fueled every late night, every risk, every calculated move, not to show them, but to make sure I never needed them. And that's what they never understood. I didn't build success to earn their praise. I built it so I could finally walk into a room full of people who thought they knew me and smile, knowing they didn't know a thing. They saw Julian, the quiet cousin, the one who couldn't settle, the one who hadn't made it. What they didn't see, what they still didn't see, was that I had made something far bigger than their approval. I had made a legacy they would soon find themselves answering to. I began building Arclight Partners in a spare Lisbon apartment, with no desk, just a folding table and the quiet hum of determination. I didn't need a name. I needed results. I studied failing firms, like surgeons study cadavers, finding where blood stopped flowing, where greed had bloated function, where leadership had dulled into legacy. I understood something my family never did. Most power is inherited, not earned, and those who inherit it rarely protect it well. They preserve image, not value. That's where I made my move. Luca Vega Capital had been bloated for years. Flashy deals, over-leveraged plays, PR fluff paraded as growth. They never noticed the tiny cracks forming beneath their foundation, but I did. I'd known their structure intimately since the beginning. Luca would email me decks asking for feedback, not realizing I kept every file, every number, every timestamp. When they went regional in 2019, I flagged 3 of their vendors for regulatory red flags. Luca ignored me. When they announced their expansion into LATAM, I saw they were piggybacking off outdated cost forecasts. They didn't even bother adjusting for inflation. Arrogance makes for easy targets. I didn't come at them directly. That would have been emotional. No, I created 3 shell companies under distinct international LLCs, each focused on a specific acquisition target: vendor logistics, B2B tech, and compliance solutions. Over the course of 18 months, I quietly acquired controlling interests in nearly every third-party service provider Vega Capital relied on. Slowly, silently, I became their infrastructure, their operations, their compliance, their offshore backend, all mine. And they never even blinked. The moment that truly sealed it came when Vega Capital's VP of Strategy reached out to one of my shells, asking for emergency cost restructuring on a failing partnership in Singapore. I played along. offered generous terms, then watched as their projections spun tighter into my net. The more they tried to scale, the more they owed me leverage. And not once did they think to trace the thread back to me, because who would suspect Julian, the cousin who still freelanced? My legal team secured everything behind layered trusts and European holding accounts. No direct line to my name. But when the time came, when the financial house of cards trembled just enough, I made my offer, not public, not loud. A direct bid sent through legal counsel. Arclight Partners seeks to acquire Vega Capital Group in full. At first, Luca thought it was a joke. Then he called me. Why would a ghost firm even want us, he asked, sarcasm masking the panic. Because, I replied, ghosts don't knock, they walk through walls. The board approved the sale within 2 weeks. The offer was clean, legally airtight, and generous enough to ease their fear of collapse. But I included one clause they didn't notice, or rather didn't understand, until it was too late. All executive positions would be restructured post-acquisition, with board approval led by the majority shareholder, me. The same cousin they called directionless, the same man they never bothered to learn about. By the time they looked up, I wasn't the outsider. I was the future they didn't see coming. It started with whispers, the kind that live in boardrooms long after meetings end. Luca's name stopped commanding the same respect. Investors began to ask quiet questions about forecasts that suddenly didn't align, about projections that felt more like hope than data. The financial world has a scent for blood, and Vega Capital had just begun to bleed. Meanwhile, I said nothing. I let the machine do what it was built to do, reveal truth. The first domino fell when our compliance review flagged a conflict of interest in one of their European funds. It wasn't criminal, but it was sloppy, and in our hands it was leverage. Luca tried to downplay it in a press release, but the media dug deeper. The second came when our infrastructure division, formerly their logistics partner, raised prices subtly across 3 continents. Operational costs soared. Deadlines slipped. The board began to panic. Still, no one saw my hand. That was the point. At the next family dinner, just 2 weeks before the public acquisition would be announced, Luca gave a speech, said the firm was streamlining operations, preparing for a new era of growth. I clinked my glass and smiled. Laughter floated around the room, but I could see it in his eyes. He was losing grip. The confidence was a veneer now. The empire he had spent a decade building on family reputation was buckling under the weight of its own blind ambition, and I had engineered every quiet crack. Aunt Marisol pulled me aside before dessert. Her voice was soft, lined with confusion. "Julian, do you know anything about the changes at Vega Capital? Your cousin seems distracted." I just offered a gentle shrug. "Sometimes growth brings storms," she nodded slowly. "Not understanding, not yet." But the storm had already made landfall. Their legal department had begun internally auditing, desperate to track the ownership lines. But the maze I built was too deep, too wide. Every shell, every fund, every asset, strategically layered, internationally sealed. The following week, Vega Capital lost their Southeast Asia contract. A government review found their compliance partner, mine, now had ceased communication due to strategic realignment. They blamed Luca, he blamed the board. But the truth, I'd simply pulled a thread. The collapse had begun, quiet, surgical, unstoppable. The media started circling, sniffing a shift. But all press releases from Vega Capital remained curated and defensive. "We're adapting to market demands," they claimed. "We're positioning for long-term value." No one believed them. I watched it all unfold from a conference room 40 stories above downtown Chicago, surrounded by my team, my counsel, and my silence. "Do we initiate public control?" my general counsel asked. I shook my head. Not yet. I wanted the moment to land like thunder. I wanted the family, my family, to hear the storm only once it was directly overhead. They needed to feel it. Not as vengeance, but as clarity. The empire wasn't being attacked. It was being acquired. Quietly, legally, irrevocably. The day the story broke, the sky over Laguna was as clear as glass. I wasn't there, but I imagined the look on Luca's face when he opened the Wall Street Ledger's headline, "Ghost Firm Acquires Vega Capital in Hostile Takeover, Majority Shareholder Revealed." Beneath it, my name, Julian Vega, Founder, CEO, Arclight Partners. The article laid out the acquisition in cold, unflinching detail: strategic buyouts, offshore holdings, layered trusts, a complete dismantling of the family's financial crown jewel, orchestrated by the cousin they'd ignored. My phone didn't stop buzzing for hours. Missed calls from Luca, voicemails from Uncle Leon that started calm, then unraveled into desperate demands for explanations. One text from my mother simply read, "Julian, what have you done?" I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't hiding. I was just done explaining myself to people who had never cared to understand me. That afternoon, they showed up. All of them. At the Arclight Tower in downtown San Francisco. Security called up from the private lobby. "They're here. Your family." I stood, straightened my jacket, and told them to send them in. Luca led the charge, his suit wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. "What the hell is this?" he barked. "You're behind this. You're the one who's been gutting our operations." I didn't raise my voice. "I've been acquiring value," I said simply. "Cleaning up what you let bloat. This was business, not personal." Uncle Leon, red-faced and shaking, slammed a hand on the glass conference table. "You think this makes you powerful? Betraying your own blood?" I looked at him calmly. "I didn't betray anyone. I just stopped pretending I owed you silence." Aunt Marisol sat down without speaking. She stared at me like I was some stranger. Maybe I was. Maybe I always had been. The version of me they'd known, the agreeable one, the invisible one, had been a placeholder. This was the real Julian. Luca dropped into a chair, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything we gave you." I met his eyes. "You gave me nothing. You tolerated me. You dismissed me. You smiled at me while slicing me out of every conversation, every deal, every legacy. This is the return on your investment." He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand. "No more speeches, Luca. You built your house on credit and arrogance. I just made sure it didn't collapse on the next fool who inherited it." The room went still. Only the sound of the city buzzed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then, one by one, they looked down at their phones. The final press statement had gone live. Vega Capital's leadership had been dissolved. A transition team appointed by Arclight was now in charge. Every title they had clung to gone. Every illusion they'd clung to shattered. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply stood in the truth. They had called me a failure. Now they sat in a tower built from every stone they'd thrown. They left in silence. Luca walked out first, his shoulders hunched, eyes glazed with the weight of a crown he'd never truly earned. Uncle Leon followed, muttering about lawyers and legacy, his voice hollow in the marble corridor. Aunt Marisol paused the longest. She looked back at me with a mix of grief and disbelief. Not because I had taken something from them, but because she had finally seen who I truly was and knew that I'd never needed their permission to become him. I didn't feel victorious, not in the way movies try to sell revenge. There was no rush, no glee, just clarity, cold and clean. I had spent years moving quietly, not to destroy what they'd built, but to build something better in its place, something real, sustainable, and free of ego. I had learned to build power that didn't announce itself, just like the best systems do. And now the proof of that power was impossible to ignore. A few weeks later, we held the first board meeting under ArcLight's full control. No more Vega emblems, no more bloated portfolios built for PR, just clean lines, smart capital, and measurable value. I sat at the head of the table in a tailored navy suit. No family crest, no old ghosts, just me. When the meeting ended, one of the new directors pulled me aside and said, "Your acquisition strategy was genius, but what made you wait this long?" I looked out the window at the skyline I used to dream about. "I was never waiting," I said. "I was calculating." The next Vega family gathering was smaller, quieter. The old bravado had dimmed. No more announcements of IPOs or magazine features. The patio at my mother's house buzzed, instead with the sounds of children, real conversations and something else, respect. Not all of them looked at me the same, and that was fine. I hadn't come to reclaim a seat at the table. I came to sit down because I built the table now, and those who knew, knew. Later that evening, Luca approached me by the fire pit. No cameras, no audience. Just two men who shared blood and a long, painful past. "You always wanted to prove something to us," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I wanted to prove something to myself, that I could build without bitterness, that I could win without shouting, and that I didn't need your approval to do either." He nodded slowly, perhaps for the first time truly hearing me. We didn't hug. We didn't shake hands, but he didn't look away either. That was enough. The next morning, I stood in my office, coffee in hand, the skyline washed in gold. Our new acquisition reports were strong. ArcLight was now managing over $60 billion in assets, but none of it defined me. What did? The quiet decisions, the steady moves, the choice to rise without spectacle. To anyone out there who's been overlooked, underestimated, or boxed in by someone else's definition of success, I hope you understand now. Legacy isn't built through noise. It's built in silence, by those willing to keep showing up long after the world stops watching.